The night shift at St. Margaret's Hospital stood on the edge of town, an aging relic from a bygone era. Its towering stone walls loomed over the surrounding area, casting long shadows even on the brightest days. The hospital had once been the pride of the city, a beacon of hope for the sick and injured, but that was decades ago. Now it was a crumbling shell with most of its wards empty and its corridors rarely walked. However, a small section of the hospital remained functional, still used as a basic care facility. There, doctors and nurses worked their shifts, tending to the few patients who hadn't been transferred to more modern medical centers. Most of them dreaded working the night shift, but for Alice it was a welcome change from the chaos of the daytime. She liked the quiet, the solitude. At least she used to. The beginning of the shift. It was a cold, rainy night when Alice arrived for her shift. The storm had knocked out the power in parts of the city, and St. Margaret's was running on backup generators. The lights in the hospital flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows along the long, dimly lit hallways. "Great," Alice muttered to herself as she walked through the front doors. The security guard, Tom, sat at the reception desk looking half asleep. "Power's been going in and out all day," Tom said with a yawn. "Gonna be a long night?" Alice gave him a small smile. "As long as it stays quiet, I don't mind." Tom chuckled. "Yeah, well, this place gets a little too quiet at night if you ask me." Alice waved him off and headed to the nurse's station. There were only a few patients in the hospital that night. An elderly man recovering from surgery, a young woman with a broken leg, and an older lady with dementia who wandered the halls if left unattended. Alice went through her routine, checking patient charts, making rounds, and ensuring the monitors were functioning properly. Everything seemed normal, aside from the occasional flicker of the lights. By midnight, she was settled into the nurse's station, the soft hum of the machines providing a soothing background noise. But then something strange happened. The mysterious call. The phone rang. It startled Alice, as the phone on the night shift rarely rang. She picked it up, expecting it to be one of the other nurses or maybe Tom at the front desk. "Hello, this is Alice at the nurse's station," she said. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a faint voice came through, barely audible over the static. "He's coming," the voice whispered. Alice frowned. "Hello? Who is this?" More static crackled on the line, and then the voice repeated, "He's coming." The line went dead. Alice stared at the phone, her heart pounding slightly. She quickly dialed Tom at the front desk. "Tom, did you just try to call me?" she asked when he answered. Tom sounded confused. "No, why? Everything okay?" Alice hesitated. "Yeah, it's fine. I just got a weird call, that's all." Tom laughed lightly. "You're probably just hearing things. This place can mess with your head, especially at night." Alice hung up, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling the call had left behind. She checked on her patients again, finding everything in order. But as she returned to her station, the feeling of being watched crept over her. The unseen presence. At around 1:30 a.m., the power flickered again. This time it didn't come back on right away. The backup generators kicked in, but the lights dimmed, casting long, unsettling shadows in the hallways. Alice grabbed a flashlight and decided to do another round. As she walked through the darkened corridors, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom, she noticed something strange. In the distance, at the far end of one of the halls, she saw a figure. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a man, tall and thin, standing completely still. His head was slightly bowed, and his face was obscured by the darkness. "Hello?" Alice called out, her voice echoing down the hall. The figure didn't move. Alice felt her heart rate quicken, but she tried to remain calm. It was probably just one of the patients, maybe the elderly man who'd gotten confused and wandered out of his room. She took a few steps closer, but as she did, the figure seemed to retreat further into the shadows. "Sir, you need to go back to your room," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly backed away, disappearing around the corner. Alice's hands tightened on the flashlight. She hurried to the corner, her pulse racing, but when she turned it, the figure was gone. The hallway stretched out in front of her, empty and silent. "Okay, this is getting weird," she muttered to herself. She checked the patient rooms again. Everyone was accounted for. The elderly man was sound asleep. The young woman with the broken leg hadn't moved, and the old woman with dementia was in her bed, muttering quietly to herself. Alice returned to the nurse's station, feeling more uneasy than ever. The elevator incident around 2 a.m., Alice heard the ding of the elevator. This was strange. No one ever used the elevator at this time of night, especially not on her floor. It was an old, creaky thing that was notorious for getting stuck between floors. She walked toward it, her flashlight in hand, the beam flickering slightly as she approached. The elevator doors slowly opened with a soft creak, revealing an empty interior. Alice hesitated. The elevator had a habit of randomly opening on its own, but tonight, with everything else that had been happening, it felt wrong. She stepped closer to the elevator, peering inside. It was empty, but as she reached to press the button to close the doors, she noticed something odd. On the floor of the elevator was a wet, muddy footprint. Alice's stomach twisted. No one had been outside, and the hospital was far from the beach. Where had the mud come from? The doors closed and the elevator began its ascent, the old machinery groaning and rattling as it moved up the floors. Alice watched it go, her heart pounding in her chest. She was tempted to call Tom again, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. The patient in room 3 at around 3 a.m., the hospital fell deathly quiet. The power had stabilized, but the eerie atmosphere remained. As Alice sat at her station, trying to focus on her paperwork, she suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of a heart monitor flatlining. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her stethoscope and bolted down the hall toward the room where the noise was coming from. 3B. That was the room of Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man recovering from surgery. Alice burst into the room, ready to perform CPR, but stopped dead in her tracks. Mr. Jenkins was sitting up in bed, wide awake, staring at her with terrified eyes. His heart monitor was still beeping steadily. He was fine.
"I heard it,"
Alice whispered, more to herself than to him.
"He's coming,"
Mr. Jenkins whispered suddenly, his voice trembling. Alice's heart nearly stopped. "What did you say?" Mr. Jenkins looked at her with wide, fearful eyes.
"He's coming. I've seen him. In the halls. He's been waiting for you."
Alice took a step back, her throat dry. "Who's waiting?" But Mr. Jenkins just lay back down and closed his eyes, as if he hadn't spoken at all. Alice left the room, her mind racing. She couldn't explain what was happening, but the feeling of dread was growing stronger. The final encounter at 4:30 a.m., Alice was almost at the end of her shift, but her nerves were shot. Every sound, every flicker of the lights set her on edge. She had checked the halls again, but the strange figure hadn't reappeared. Just as she was about to sit down, she heard a soft whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone calling her name from far away.
"Alice."
Her blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, shining her flashlight down the hall.
"Alice."
The voice was closer now, but she saw no one. Her hands shook as she backed up toward the nurse's station. Suddenly, the power flickered, and all the lights went out, plunging the entire floor into darkness. Her flashlight sputtered and died. "Alice!" The voice was right next to her now. She turned, her heart racing, and saw him. The figure from the hall stood mere feet away, his gaunt face pale and sunken, his eyes hollow and black. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and he reached out toward her with long, bony fingers. Alice screamed, backing away as the figure moved closer. She could feel the cold radiating from him, the chill seeping into her bones. With a surge of adrenaline, she bolted toward the stairs, not daring to look back. She ran down flight after flight, her heart pounding in her ears, until she burst through the doors and out into the parking lot. The rain had stopped, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft pink glow over the horizon. Alice collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath as the cold, unseen presence seemed to lift. But even as she sat there, trembling, she knew one thing for certain. She would never set foot in St. Margaret's Hospital again.